3. Account paid. Kabul, Afghanistan, July 14th to 16th. Compared to Delhi, it was cool at Kabul International Airport, with the morning breeze sweeping southwards from the Pagman Ranges and the snow-capped Hindu Kush standing sentinel beyond. The Mirza had no problems with the customs officials, but he was kept waiting while people rushed about, looking for the immigration police. There were Russians everywhere, shouting and running about, nothing like the controlled, efficient machines of popular fancy. Their frustration was not helped by the attitude of the Afghan officials, never known for their urbanity, who were plainly disgruntled and showed it at every opportunity. The whole effect was unusual, almost quaint. It could well have been the performance of a very bad play, he thought, written and directed by someone who was trying too hard to imagine what a Central Asian country under Soviet domination might be like. It was midday before he got to the city centre, and 12:30 when he found his kinsman, the retired Colonel Sakafi, at his house near Tiger Gate, on one of the two hills which cut the Afghan capital in two. The Mirza had taken great care to make sure that nobody was following him. The old colonel was sitting in a chair, swathed in an eiderdown draped over a low table, underneath which hot air blew from an electric fan heater at his feet. He didn't mind when the power failed. It meant that the guerrillas had sabotaged the power lines again. The colonel showed delight, but no surprise, at the arrival of his guest. He'd sent the message, after all, and had known there would be some kind of answer soon. The Mirza embraced him and took a place beside him in the sandali. Aslam Jan is dead, killed by the Rus. Captured in Panjshir Valley mouth with other guerrillas, tortured and hanged. We buried him, of course, but he has yet to be avenged. Yes. Verily we are from him, and to him we must return. Since this is a matter of badal, blood feud, we have to know who was responsible so that I can do my duty. We do know. The Mujahid commander sent us word that we could have the right of retaliation in accordance with tradition. We have to deal with a Colonel Vasily Sementsev. Who is he, and where is he to be found? Russian KGB, Colonel, State Security. His office, well guarded, is in the city, not far from here. He also killed another Afghan, named Lalbaz of Turkestan, in the street a week ago, without penalty. We'd have executed him anyway for that. Where does he live? He occupies, with his wife, a large villa on the Bagram Road, a mile or so out of town. It was built by Zaki Poladi. I know the house. We'll have to reconnoitre the area, though. We can do that very quickly. How long are you here for? Colonel, I must catch the Air India flight to New Delhi, leaving Kabul airport on Friday morning at 09:25 your time. Mirza, that means you've only got tomorrow. It will be hard to discover his routine in that time, almost impossible, I would say. We'll have to do what we can. What gun have you got? I'd like a long-range rifle. The colonel smiled. Oh, my brother, I have a lovely one all ready for you. Follow me, and I'll show it to you now. The old man led the way to his woodshed in the garden behind the house. Inside it, a camouflaged door swung aside when the colonel pulled on it. I keep a small heater in here to make sure all is dry and ready, he said. The shed had been built against a small cave, which was full of weapons. The Mirza didn't like the look of the bundles of dynamite sticks so near the naked lamp flame, but he said nothing. Pulling a long package wrapped in plastic sheeting from a wooden box, Colonel Sakafi presented it to the Mirza, holding it on the inside of his forearms, palms upraised. It was the gesture of the armourer offering his weapon to the crescentader, the mujahid of old. Both smiled. There was hunting to be done. Back in the house, the Mirza looked at his new gun. New it was, all right. It had hardly been used. A Soviet SKD, a Samosajdish Karabin Dragunov, a beautifully made sniper's carbine. It was well greased, and there were 5 10-round magazines with it. 50 shots, 7.62 millimeters long, he said, counting them. That's right. Isn't it enough? Plenty. However did you get hold of it? The Russians are corrupt as all hell, said the colonel. Believe it or not, this gun was sold to someone I know by a Nikolai officer who offered it for foreign currency. It cost us $500. On the frontier, it would fetch $5,000 from a Pashtun chief. Foreign currency buys comfort in the USSR, said the Mirza. He was cleaning off the storage grease. But guns buy death in occupied countries, said Colonel Sakafi. Just look at that telescopic sight. High precision. That's why it's called a snaperskaya, a sniping rifle by the Russians. You know a lot about it. The Mirza was interested. I have always liked guns. After all, I'm an old infantryman. You cavalry people are always lurching about. How can you take aim from a horse's back? You don't really know what shooting is. I can shoot all right, said the Mirza, although I admit I learned most of it on the range and tiger hunting. But give me some more details. I don't know these guns at all. Right. What do you want to know? Ammunition? Range? Special ammunition for maximum accuracy. Accurate to about 1,300 meters. The weight is about 4.5 kilograms or 10 pounds to you Anglo-Saxons. Anglo-Saxon trained, if you don't mind. What's the muzzle velocity? Of the order of 800 meters a second. Say about 2,600 feet per second. Better than the Kalashnikov and equal to most heavy machine guns. Excellent, said the Mirza. They discussed transport. What's the most unobtrusive vehicle we can get for a short field survey? Mirza Timur Khel was not well up on Kabul conditions under the Russians. A motorcycle. The Nikolais hardly ever stop and check people on them. Can we get hold of one? Yes, we'll call in Halim. He lives just down the road. Can we trust him? Completely. We have worked together before. While they sat drinking tea with ground cardamoms, Anis, the houseboy, slipped out of the house to call the man with the transport. It was a large, gleaming BMW, the R65 model, bought by a grinning youth with the European, red-haired, freckled-faced looks which have always surprised foreigners, who imagined that all Afghans were swarthy. He worked for Afghan Tour, the semi-official Kabul agency which once organised sightseeing trips around the country. Halim's seen Sementsev several times, the colonel said, so he can tell you what he looks like. The Mirza questioned Halim. Well, he looks very ordinary, just like a Russian, medium height, I suppose. I've only seen him sitting down in cars and restaurants. Halim Jan, can't I get just a look at him somehow, or see a photograph? No, Mirza Seb, there's no hope of that. These people always rush from one place to another, never lingering anywhere. You never get a good look at them. You could only see him at the office, and that's too dangerous. Otherwise, he'll be at the house or at one of the prisons or interrogation centres. Could you do me a sketch, or do all Russians look alike to you? Halim tried. It wasn't very successful. It's not that they look alike, it's just that this man is so ordinary. Like a man behind a desk, a minor official, quiet. Doesn't shout or wave his arms or anything. I'm sorry, Mirza. It's all right, Halim. He's a KGB colonel. Does he wear uniform? No, none of them do, except on special or social occasions. No limp, spectacles, broken nose, bald head, or anything? No. He must be about 40, and he has a Slav face, blue eyes and high cheekbones. A lot of them look like that. That would have to do. They had a meal, and then the Mirza, with Colonel Sakafi riding pillion on the big motorcycle, rode out along the excellent highway to look at Sementsev's house. They cruised around, the huge machine burbling beneath them, noting trees, wells, culverts, and the like. They went to pay their respects at the grave of Aslam Jan. The Mirza placed a token handful of earth upon it and made his pledge of requital. Just before the sunset curfew, they rode back into the city. Nobody had taken any interest in them. This, they agreed, may have been because almost everyone riding a motorcycle these days, especially a powerful one, was an official or in the police. The Mirza worked with the rifle, cleaning and getting to know it, even speaking to it. It had been well protected, wrapped in oiled cloth and the barrel plugged. Its box had been part filled with sawdust to absorb moisture. The colonel had packed the ammunition in silica gel, guarding against condensation, the worst enemy of the rifleman. The Mirza field-stripped the weapon with the greatest care, studying the mechanism and the electrics of the sight. After admiring again the scooped-out butt, which so effectively reduced its weight, he placed the gun in a secret hiding place under the floorboards of the study, had a light meal of tea, bread, and soup, and went to bed. He had decided not to take the rifle outside to try any ranging shots to get his eye in. Someone might hear. Besides, trying to kill with a gun he'd never shot with was Mirza the hunter's way of giving the Russian just a little better chance. Thursday morning was clear and slightly sharp at first, with very little wind. As the sun rose, the Afghan Tour Land Rover, a long wheelbase model with a soft top, driven by Halim, arrived at the house to collect the colonel and the tourist from Delhi for a sightseeing trip. They drove around, scouting, looking again at the lie of the land for 2 hours, and breakfasted in a wood 6 miles from the city. They slowly formed their plan, going over the arrangements again and again in the greatest possible detail. When the Land Rover next appeared on the road where the KGB chief's house was situated, the business-suited tourist was no longer to be seen. Mirza, sitting beside the driver, now wore the garb of a Pashtun hillman, voluminous shirt, baggy trousers, turban wound over a conical skullcap. 800 yards from the target, Halim stopped the vehicle, and the Mirza, thanking him volubly in rustic Pashtu for the lift, took his sacking-covered bundle from the back and started to walk along the road. Halim accelerated away with a wave and a shouted, "Happy hunting!" A massive Pashtun tribesman, somewhat down on his luck and therefore having to work for effete Kabulis, bearing a heavy pack with his tools in it, was the most natural sight in the world to those who passed him as he trudged along. The houses, standing for the most part among trees, were each of 2 or 3 stories, built in late Victorian style in the 1900s. Each was surrounded by a wall and usually guarded by a night watchman. There were many trees thereabouts, and the Mirza, during his reconnaissance, had marked down the perfect one for his purposes. It was a massive mulberry, with just the right kind of branches for a makhan, the hide which he or his shikari had prepared in North India so many times in the past. Sitting in such a tree, with a goat tethered in the killing zone, the hunter waited until the tiger, on the prowl, came for the captive animal. When he had killed and was eating the goat, 1 shot would be quite enough. The mulberry stood alone, but in such a position that, by climbing upon an orchard boundary wall, he could reach its lower branches without being seen from any angle. How useful that Afghans had walled orchards far from any house. It was more difficult to climb, the trunk was smoother, and the bundle with the rifle heavier than he had thought. He was also less agile than he used to be. A man of 50 in the Afghan glens is usually still very active, but in the softer life of Delhi one tends to put on weight. Now he was up. As he had guessed, the tree afforded perfect cover and a clear line of sight to the house he wanted, which must be, he squinted at the first story, level with his seat, must be about 650 yards away. There was no wind. He unwrapped the bundle and took out the rifle, a hammer, a large nail and a magazine, already charged with 10 7.62mm shells. At this range, a bullet would take under a second to cover the distance to the target. He would be firing at only half the maximum effective range of the gun, so its accuracy would be that much greater. He hammered the nail into the branch at his side and hung the sackcloth from it. He snapped the magazine in and felt the gun assume the configuration and balance which had been designed into it. Using the knurled wheel of the sight, he brought the front door of the house into focus and read off the scale. Exactly 600 meters. 600 meters is 650 yards. Good guess. He set the range into the elevation knob and squinted at his target, using the point of the top chevron as his aiming point. The horizontal scale was obviously for wind correction. There was no wind at the moment, but if one sprang up later, he might need more than one shot. On the other hand, at this relatively close range, the wind might not matter. He'd know when the time came. The Mirza was a good enough shot to drill a hole in the centre of an object 2.5 inches by 3.5 at this range, and that was precisely what he was proposing to do, the size of a man's forehead. He looked at his watch. 8:40 a.m. Sementsev might have left the house by now for his office in the city. If he was still at home, he would probably leave soon, and this would not allow much time to kill him and make the final arrangements for his escape. If he could get to his chosen hideout in broad daylight. That would be very dangerous indeed, but the Mirza, thinking of Aslam Jan hanged from a tree, was not concerned about that. The main thing would be to keep young Halim and the colonel out of trouble. If the Mirza himself died, well, he'd had most of his life anyway. Now for the house itself. He had done well to choose this tree and not to try to get any nearer. The place was surrounded by barbed wire. He could see the drive and the front of the house, and there were at least 3 sentry boxes and a dog patrol. There were signs that a metal girder tower was being built, and what looked like parts for an observation platform and a demounted searchlight lay on the ground beside it. Tools and sandbags too. They were about to turn the place into a fortress. He was too far away for the dogs to be a problem. After all, there must be plenty of other people passing within this distance of the house, and the animals must be trained to disregard them. The dogs were German shepherds, really vicious-looking ones. Their handlers were Russians in grey fur caps, Kalashnikovs slung across their backs. There was no radio mast on the roof, but twin telephone wires ran on poles from above the porch towards the main road. Presumably they joined the ground at that point. So far, it was obvious, the place had not been proofed against long-distance attack, against shelling mortars or a sniper. There were bars, but no sandbags and probably no toughened glass in the windows. They had just rigged up a defence against a fairly weak frontal attack. Quite enough during the first months of the occupation, of course, since most of the active snipers of Afghanistan were to be found in the south, towards or on the Pakistan frontier. Anyway, few of them had precision rifles effective over really long distances. Perhaps later, thought the Mirza, they will wake up and cut down this mulberry. But that would be helpful, one hoped, only to Sementsev's replacement. Still no signs of Sementsev. The garage doors were shut, no car was visible. Did transport call for Sementsev, or did he drive himself? Anyway, it was time to check the other line of sight. Over to his right, just under a kilometre away, was the second house. It was higher, standing on a mound, and it had 3 stories with large windows. On the long, flat roof, too thin for him to see at this distance, there was a very long washing line. He could see its white-painted poles. The Mirza took out a matchbox and opened it. He unwound a long, thin wire attached to a tiny instrument, a mass of fine, soldered wires and transistors mounted on a scrap of circuit board, with a built-in miniature microphone, a matchbox-sized VHF-FM transmitter powered by a 9-volt battery. The wire was the transmitting antenna, and the range was 1,218 meters. The washing line was, he measured the posts with the rangefinder, 900 meters away. Excellent. The module was preset for sending on 100 megahertz in the VHF band. It could be heard on any ordinary VHF receiver, the kind that thousands of people had, even in Kabul. It could also be picked up, of course, in the Sementsev house, if anyone was listening on 100 megahertz. But that would hardly matter, even if they were. Very short transmissions, under 3 minutes in duration, couldn't be located, so let Sementsev hear if he liked. He placed the wire carefully, so that there was no tree, no building between it and the house with the washing line. What was the time? Just coming up to 9 o'clock. He was to check in every hour on the hour. At a few seconds to 9, the Mirza connected the battery to the tiny set to activate it and started to speak. No report. Show now if receiving. This was short and equivocal enough. Someone who just happened to be receiving on 100 megahertz at that moment might miss it, or would assume that it was a military or test transmission. He disconnected the battery and looked towards the washing line. It was fluttering with white sheets. Colonel Sakafi had heard, knew that the hunter had reached his makan, and had nothing to report. Communications were working perfectly. The Mirza stowed the radio back in the pocket of his Pashtun shirt and looked towards the KGB man's house again. Still no movement. The tiny set which the Mirza carried had been brought back from London 2 years ago by a student who had bought it for amusement. He had soon tired of the little toy, and it had quickly found its way to the resistance when the Russians banned all non-official transmissions and equipment in the country. It had only cost £4 in England, and it ran for 65 hours on a battery, the colonel had said. It was a perfect shooting day, calm and quiet, crisp and clear. Where was Sementsev? Mirza tried to visualize his prey. Russian, 40, ordinary. Not exactly a classical villain. Perhaps it was just as well that he didn't have a grotesque description to contend with. This was, after all, to be an execution. But if he'd seen him, there would be less chance of killing the wrong man. Now that was where a tiger shoot was easier than a manhunt. When the tiger arrived, you knew your target. You didn't shoot a jackal which happened to be prowling around instead. And, of course, you had the goat. But where was the goat in this case? The question turned around in his head. Find the goat to Sementsev's tiger. If he could solve that one, there need be no mistake. Put it into the back of your mind, Mirza told himself, and let your brain solve it. He took out some food, white cheese, bread and walnuts, pickles and a gulp of water from his flask. Hunting sharpened the appetite. Colonel Sakafi sat by the washing line on the flat roof of his old army comrade's house, waiting for the signal. He had the keys to the building, and it was so well protected, with iron bars and shutters, that Jasmine House needed no watchman. The colonel went in from time to see that all was well. Akram, who owned it, was always in Jalalabad at this time of year, where he had relatives and business interests. It was warmer, more comfortable down there. Akram had said, "Use the place for whatever you will, my dear brother. A man cannot be in two houses at once. The opportunity is dear, as the saying goes, and time is a sword." This proverb, therefore, had been chosen as the basis of the code which the Mirza would use to signal when he was to be picked up. The place they had already arranged, a large single-segment drainage pipe positioned by the main road, dry at this time of year. The pipe was intended to carry the runoff from the slope above it to prevent the carriageway becoming a river when it rained. If the Mirza finished the present matter quickly, he would have to be picked up soon after, and at great risk. If he had to wait until darkness, or even stay all night at his post, he would have to be collected in time to catch the plane to Delhi, which left Kabul airport at 9:25 the next morning. 24 hours left, as of now. Colonel Sementsev sat in his office and looked at the transistorized clock on the wall opposite. 9 a.m. He had left the house early that morning to look in at the prison to see how the Stukachis were getting on. These were the paid KGB informers, some of them prisoners, some guards and the rest officials, who provided him with a useful stream of information. He was an expert in this field, and also in planting agents provocateurs, an ancient KGB tradition. He had suggested to the Moscow people, when that old fool General Kishneev was repatriated, that he might be put in a ward full of Stukachis in the mental hospital. The result? Kishneev had named in conversation several Red Army officers of high rank. They were sick of the brutality of the occupation forces in Afghanistan, as he had put it. In typical bourgeois capitalist jargon, of course. Sementsev had been commended by the comrade chairman personally. Well, in a letter, of course. That was pretty well the same thing as seeing him personally. Outstanding zeal in defense of socialism. What melodious words. It could mean promotion. There were things to attend to. He lifted the handset and telephoned his wife. "Natalia, is everything in order?" Natalia Sementseva was breathless with excitement. "Everything is fine, Vasily. All the food is in, all the drink, and the music is arranged." "Excellent. And everyone is coming?" "Yes, everyone who is anyone. I'm so excited." "Well, Natalia, just to confirm, I make it 30 officers of the administration, that is, rather, the fraternal advisory groups helping the Afghan government. Some of them are high-ranking apparatchiki, permanent party officials, you know." "I know, Vasily. You really are wonderful to get them. Of course, after the comrade chairman's message—" "Yes, people are beginning to recognize our contribution at last, after all this time. Well, we start eating at 9, and after that we'll have the music and dancing." Sementsev was rather good at the tango and the foxtrot, the latest dances in his circle in the USSR of the 80s. None of that rock and roll, of course. The chairman didn't like it. So far, the birdie was not frowned upon. People flapped their arms on the dance floor and clapped their hands as they hopped. But the Soviet Deputy Minister of Culture had just warned that Western music undermined youth. Of course, there will be speeches and toasts and some moving patriotic songs, the colonel told his wife. It was Sementsev's 44th birthday. Entertainment always helped to cement contacts, especially when people were away from home, serving the motherland in distant countries. The guests may leave by midnight, but you realize, don't you, that these important occasions sometimes continue into the small hours? Oh yes, I know, that's just fine. But you won't be late, Vasily. You'll be sure to be here to receive the guests. Of course I shall be, my little pigeon. Home by about 8:45. I have some very important interviews and so on. State affairs, you know. He broke off. One mustn't talk about official matters to one's wife, or on the telephone. Is the hot water system repaired yet, Natalia? It is? Good. And remember to have the servants put the red bunting up across the chandeliers. Well, I must go now. There are some important visitors to see. Sementsev put the instrument back in its cradle and shouted into the hall. Boy, bring tea, and make it Indian tea with lemon and a lot of sugar, not that horrible green Chinese stuff. There were dozens of files to study. Moscow believed in keeping people busy. He leafed through the papers, reports on foreign infiltrators. He knew that none had been caught or even really suspected, but the Kremlin had announced that foreigners, CIA men, were helping the Afghans. It would be a feather in his cap if he could find even one. He put that file aside for urgent attention. Then there were all the forms to fill in about former Russians, émigrés resident in Afghanistan, and about suspect Afghans, people who had been abroad or who hadn't been seen lately. Give those to Prem Lal, that stupid Hindu in Afghan state security. The preposterous fool who thought he should have the Order of the Red Banner just for working 30 years undercover for us in the police in Kabul. The morning wore on. At midday, Sementsev called for his big chaika and driver to take him out to the Intercontinental to lunch. Kabul was warm, but the cool breeze from the Pagman Mountains made it very pleasant. From 2 p.m. until the office closed at 4:30, Sementsev did more office work, but mostly mused about the important prisoner he'd got in the bag. It was a woman, an Afghanka who had been educated in Europe, an official of the Afghan Red Crescent, raising funds from charity sales and luncheons among the diplomatic wives, that kind of thing. Her name was Halima Iskandari, and she had been married to a former professor at Kabul University who had disappeared. Almost all the academic staff, of course, were traitors. 3 months after the occupation, over 80% of them had fled from the socialist regime. This woman hadn't fled. When her husband disappeared, into Pulichaki jail in fact, she had organized demonstrations by the families of the suspects at the gates. When she was arrested and added to the catch, she had talked. Not directly, but foolishly. She had confided to another woman, one of Sementsev's prisoner informers, that she had information that the Russians wanted more than anything else. She knew, she said, the exact location of the Eagle's headquarters. And now, Sementsev smiled confidently to himself, she would tell him. The informant had been very clever in 2 ways. She had pretended to cry and had constantly wailed that if only the Eagle were there, he would help them. And she had had the sense not to say anything to the Afghan guards, even to the commandant of the prison. She had reported the news directly to Sementsev. Too many Afghans were turubchas, radishes, red outside but white, non-communist inside. One of the reasons the Eagle and his band had got away with so much, Sementsev was sure, was that even the senior members of the Afghan security services were traitors. Or at least several of them must be. Well, this time the KGB's equivalent in Afghanistan, the KHAD, would know nothing about it. Not until the Eagle was caught, anyway. Then perhaps Sementsev's promotion would come through. He'd already been told by his mentor in Moscow that something might be done for him, if only there were some fact, some achievement to back up a recommendation for a transfer to a more pleasant spot. Frankly, Vasily Petrovich, though I have influence, there has to be something more concrete to reward. I got you the posting to Kabul, remember, to enable you to distinguish yourself. Well, he'd provide something. The capture of the Eagle, the man that all Kabul looked upon as their hero. He sat back in his chair. It was too soon to interview that Iskandari woman. They hadn't finished softening her up. They could be very tough, those Afghan crones. Yes, a posting to somewhere really comfortable, really pleasant. Paris? Rome? Washington? The head of the German Democratic Republic's police mission in Kabul, now reorganizing the Afghan political police, had told him and Natalia wonderful tales of the life in the United States. He'd been there, operating undercover, undetected for years. A burst of wild, wailing music broke into his thoughts. Sementsev frowned. And he'd get away from all the physical danger that was getting worse in Kabul by the day, and from the incessant, hideous Indian film music played day and night from the next-door building. There, the Pakistan Freedom Movement, the Zulfikar organization, had their offices. The Red Afghan government had given them sanctuary when they stole a Pakistani aircraft. When the office closed, Sementsev had himself driven to a villa, formerly King Amanullah Khan's, at Dar al-Aman. It had been built 60 years before, in Afghan Baroque style, a mixture of Saracenic and French bourgeois. The general effect was of a wedding cake gone wrong. This was the secret headquarters of his interrogation unit, the Special Information Service, the Kimama. The house stood alone, in the middle of 5 acres of landscaped garden, one of those breathtakingly beautiful Afghan gardens which successive, astonished English travellers had admitted surpassed even those of their own homeland. But up the marble steps, beyond the Grecian pillars and inside the iron-studded olive-wood doors, the place was a prison. Much of the interior, the graceful reception rooms, the cool passages, the study and billiards room, had been removed. Inside the gutted shell there were now only barred cages, cells, interrogation rooms, and 1 or 2 offices for the administration. The staff were mainly Russian, with a few Afghan and Central Asian interpreters and guards. He made his way to his comfortably furnished office, with its Dowlatabad rugs, panelled walls, and great Jacobean desk, and called for vodka, the Ukrainian kind, gorilka, with plenty of red pepper and some sunflower seeds. This was, after all, cocktail time in the West, and he was preparing himself for the gracious life over there. His assistant, Kapitan Anatoly Smirnov, had the file ready. Anatoly Grigorovich, how is the prisoner Halima Iskandari? The lanky, dark-haired youth shrugged, pushed out his lower lip, narrowed his eyes. Not quite ready, Comrade Colonel. What treatment has she received? Chemical and hot physical treatment, it's all in the report. Sementsev pursed his lips and flicked his eyes across the paper. Castor oil, sodium pentothal, the truth drug, beating with whips and rubber truncheons. He noted that the document was not signed. This was an internal reference paper. It would be destroyed as soon as he was finished with it. Things like that didn't go into the files. All right, let's go. He gulped his vodka and picked up a handful of sunflower seeds. Opposite the desk on the far wall was a padded door. The two men opened it and walked down 3 or 4 steps into the interrogation chamber. It was not as well equipped as the operations room, the notorious torture chamber in the Afghan Interior Ministry's basement, Sementsev reflected, or the General Interrogation Office at the Prime Ministry, the Sedarat, but it produced far better results. In the middle of the floor, shackled to an iron chair, sat a tall, thin, middle-aged woman, wearing what remained of an expensive jacket and skirt in light tan cotton. She had a face that had been beautiful. Her black hair had been dyed. It was now growing out, showing white at the roots. She'd been stripped and beaten. Stripes of blood showed through the fabric of her outfit, in front, on the thighs, across her back. Her eyes were red and bruised, and she was filthy dirty. She had a long nose and arched eyebrows, and she scowled at the two men as they entered. The uniformed Soviet soldier, standing below the windows, saluted. 2 Russians, dressed in the standard Moscow heavy black suits of outmoded cut, stood up. They had been sitting on a padded wooden bench which was bolted to the floor. The whole place was bathed in blinding white fluorescent light from a dozen long tubes fixed to the ceiling, protected by armoured glass. Sementsev sat down and spoke to her in Dari. He already knew that she did not, or would not, speak Russian. "Good evening, my lady. Are you ready to talk?" She spat, though there was no saliva in her mouth. Sementsev smiled. He rather enjoyed this kind of thing. You might almost say, he reflected, that he had a taste for it. A little violence did a man good. A pity Natalia didn't share his interests, but even then he did manage to knock her about a bit from time to time. And it was a good old Russian custom, wasn't it? Every Russian worth a name would admit that. "Mrs. Iskandari, we know that you know where the man called the Eagle is to be found. You are going to tell us, and then we shall frame the charges for your trial. What you say now will determine whether you get a light or a heavy sentence." "I don't know what you are talking about. I have told your men that I did not say anything to that woman in the prison. She's imagining it, or she's insane." Her voice was a croak, and she felt unutterably weak. Sementsev sighed, apparently with annoyance, in fact with pleasure. What a pleasant little aperitif to his evening's entertainment. "What you do not realize, Halima dear, is that people always talk, always confess. You have read and heard, no doubt, that so-and-so was tortured but would say nothing. We who are actually involved in such things know that this is simply not true. There comes a point, if the police officer knows his job, when the suspect must talk. The mind and body, or one or the other, simply demand it. Oh yes, it makes a good film, makes a good tale, this, and he did not speak. The only circumstances in which people don't talk is when something has been bungled, or where the operator has lost interest." This was a long speech for him, but he had used it dozens of times, and liked it. Besides, in his experience it was true. The only truth he had not told her was that some people who tried to hold out went raving mad. "Bring the scorpion." He hardly turned in the direction of the Mongolian-faced jailer, one of the two in civilian clothes, as he gave the order. 2 lengths of electric cord were clipped to the metal chair. They led to a box with a glowing dial. At a signal, one of the men switched it on. The woman jerked in convulsions. By the 8th shock she was screaming as the amperage was decreased and increased to prevent her getting used to it. They threw a bucketful of cold water and carbolic disinfectant over her. When they stopped, all she wanted was a cigarette. But she couldn't have stood much more, and the Russians knew it. Sementsev smiled again. No point in making it too easy. Besides, he still had 1 or 2 other little tricks to use. He stood up and took his assistant back to his room for a few more vodkas. Wyborova from Poland this time, his favourite. The 2 guards had taken the Scorpion machine out, leaving the soldier to watch Halima. He sat quietly, looking at her. Grasping at straws, she thought that she might, even at this stage, manage to outwit the Russian beast. If she did not, she feared that she would talk. If not now, then under more drugs, and if not that, they would have something else. He looked like a Turkestani. Perhaps there was a chance. She spoke to him in colloquial Dari. "Are you a Muslim?" He lifted his big, close-shaven head and turned red-rimmed eyes towards her. It was forbidden to talk to prisoners, but he usually took risks when he felt like it. "I am an Uzbek." There wasn't much time. She knew he had a Caucasian dagger, very sharp, in his boot. She'd seen it during the last beating. "For God's sake, brother, kill me now!" She couldn't talk if she were dead. "Why, lady?" He was not surprised, only curious. "What does it matter?" He said nothing. "My relatives will give you 100 gold pieces." The Uzbek was looking interested. They'd certainly flog him, but he could say that she'd looked like breaking loose or something. He'd get his gold. It was a wild hope, but it looked as if he might really do it. He was certainly not too squeamish. But when the Uzbek stood up, as if to walk towards her, Sementsev and the lanky Smirnov came back into the room. When they had shut the door, the Uzbek saluted again. Well, that was that. The last hope gone. Sementsev snapped his fingers. "Now, madame, we shall continue. Will you speak?" She shook her head. "Burn in hell." He laughed. This was going to be good. "Bring the man in." The man must have been in the corridor just outside. Within a few seconds he was hurled into the room, fell sprawling onto the floor and was dragged across to lie between Sementsev and his victim. "Farid!" She had thought her son was safe, among the guerrillas somewhere, after he had been reported missing 3 months before. Now he lay there, a once massive 25-year-old reduced to a bundle of rags, caked with blood, one arm broken, one eye missing, moaning and half dead. Her baby, Farid, a captain in the Guards, champion marksman, best athlete in his regiment, father of her grandchildren. This ragdoll. "Water." At Sementsev's command, the Uzbek splashed the captain back to consciousness. He sat up, saw his mother, and tried to reach out to her. Sementsev rubbed his hands together. This was better than the theatre. "He doesn't know anything, I promise you," the woman shouted in her agony. Her eyes were beseeching Sementsev to show some mercy, praying that something might save her son. "Now," said the Russian, "I shall have this traitor's throat cut in front of you if you don't talk. It took a great deal of trouble and much of our blood before we caught him. He should die anyway for his treachery to socialism, to his country, and to his soldier's oath. He looked at her with an obscene sneer, the excitement rising inside him. Unless, that is, you care to tell us where the eagle is. In that case, his trial will result in, shall we say, only about 12 years rigorous imprisonment, and that is light. The Russians we retrieve from the terrorists, they die. Can I speak to him? Say anything. He made a mock courtly gesture. Farid Jan, can you hear me? Yes, mother. He tried to smile, but his contorted face would not obey. It looked terrible. Before he was handed over to the Russians, Guards Captain Farid had been tortured by the Afghan Qadi Nizami. Farid, you are an Afghan soldier. Be ready for death. It looked more like a smile now. He mumbled, I am ready. I entrust you to God. Halima Iskandari bared her teeth. Russian, lower than a monkey. You are not human beings. If you wish to do so, kill this man, because he is a man. He is ready. Sementsev was slightly sensitive to the criticism that he lacked human attributes. Indeed, as with many Russians, it was the pointing out of the obvious which annoyed him. Uncultivated Russians, for example, as Halima knew, usually became enraged at being called uncultured. Halima reflected that this, in many cases, was like being angry if you said that someone had a nose on his face. Sementsev lost his temper. He'd show her. This should break her. Cut his throat. The soldier took out a very large spring knife, snapped it open, and slashed at the young man's jugular, as Farid murmured the last words of the phrase, Verily we are from him, and to him we shall return. The blood gushed onto the floor. Within 4 or 5 minutes the body had been removed, and the place neatly scrubbed by 2 shivering prisoners with buckets and brushes. The smell of carbolic again filled the room. Sementsev recovered his temper when he saw the mother shuddering uncontrollably at what she had seen. He looked at his watch. Plenty of time for the next scene. He gave an order. A small table and a fresh bottle of vodka, with a small glass and salted nuts and raisins, kishmish, was put before him. The woman was moaning like an imbecile, but Sementsev was glad to note that she had not entirely taken leave of her senses. The next item on the program would undoubtedly provide a fitting and successful climax. She did not look up when the door clanged and another battered figure was thrown at her feet. Sementsev waited. Women were always curious. All it needed was to arouse their curiosity a little. Mrs. Iskandari, who do you think we have here? I wonder if you can guess. Sure enough, she looked. Slowly at first, then with a jerk of the head. It was her daughter, beautiful Roshana, brilliant artist, a noisy but fascinating girl, with her mother's looks and her father's personality, people said. 18 years old. Their eyes met, and Halima Iskandari felt as if something had died within her. People spoke of the fires of hell. Was there a hell worse than this? Sementsev was watching, alternately throwing back tots of white spirit and chewing nuts and raisins, a fixed smile on his face. He had looked into Halima's eyes and he had just seen what he wanted. He had won, as he'd known he would. Mrs. Iskandari, you will either talk now, or you will see what can happen to a girl with all the possible variations performed in front of you, starting with these idiots here and followed by, shall we say, 20 or 30 others? I call to you the judgment of God before tomorrow's dawn. Without knowing what she was saying, Halima screamed the words from the classics. Have fear of the cry of the oppressed. The Russian laughed, really enjoying himself. Yes, Afghanka, I'll remember that. God's going to call me for a little talk about sulphur and brimstone and demons with pitchforks before the sun rises once more. Very poetic, old witch, but you will talk now, won't you? He knew the answer before she said it. Yes, I'll talk. May God destroy you and all your people, as he has destroyed the evil ones 1,000 times before. Sementsev could hardly stop laughing. What a comedy for an atheist to see these wretched creatures relying on something that did not exist. Sementsev sent the other men out of the room. Security would have to be absolute. The secret and the credit would be his alone. He stood before her and, after a moment, nodded as though signalling the exact instant when she should speak. Halima Iskandari told him about the caves deep in the Pagman mountains where the eagle, Kush, was to be found. Sementsev slapped her face. You realize that if you have lied, you and your daughter will have to pay even more than you already have? Yes. He was too good an interrogator to doubt that she had told the truth. Then he handcuffed the girl's wrists behind her back and raped her while her mother watched. When he had finished, Sementsev got up from the floor and walked to a hook on the wall, from which he took down 2 wooden handles connected by a piece of piano wire. Slowly, with an entranced expression on his face, an expression which made him look almost benign, he strangled both the women. Security was complete. It was a very satisfactory feeling, especially as he still had his birthday party to look forward to. Dead before tomorrow's dawn, indeed. Dead? He was just beginning to live. Absolute security. The woman was dead. He'd got the eagle's location and would report it personally to the military in the morning, verbally. By tomorrow afternoon, the eagle and his band would be wiped out or in prison. Now it was time for a good hot bath, a shave, and a change into uniform. After that, a pleasant drive home to dear, plump Natalia and the birthday party which she was preparing at this very moment. He chuckled all the way to the house at the memory of the curse. Hello, God, I've come a little early, but you see this crazy Afghanka woman summoned me to appear before you before tomorrow's dawn. It was cold now in the tree, and the Mirza hadn't brought a warm coat. The quarry was undoubtedly away at work. That meant he'd have to wait until 6 at least. No sign of life from the house. Nobody had been in or out for how long? Nearly 6 hours. It was now 3 o'clock in the afternoon. There had been so little movement around the place that the Mirza, at first thankful that all was so quiet, now craved almost any stimulus, any sign that would connect him with his enemy. Only the busy helicopters on observation missions had disturbed the silence of the day. The workmen who must be involved with the improved security, the tower, the light, had not appeared. Just as well. Time to check in now. He called the colonel, sticking to the agreed wording. The washing on the line twitched in answer. Surprising how long a day could be if one was doing nothing. Suddenly, the Mirza stiffened. A delivery truck, its canvas hood strapped down, had arrived at the door of the Russian's house. The driver got down, stood by the barbed wire fence gesticulating, and seemed to be shouting. Within a few seconds the patrol appeared. Either there was nobody in the sentry boxes, or they were asleep. Anyway, the Mirza hadn't seen any guard change yet. Holding the dogs back, the guards, 2 of them, opened the gate in the fence and beckoned the vehicle inside. It was driven to the back of the house, out of sight. Well, nothing much there. It didn't look like Sementsev coming back, unless he was taking extreme precautions, a possibility which the rest of the picture did not bear out. Besides, the truck wasn't guarded or armed so far as one could see. And why would Sementsev be returning in mid-afternoon? A few minutes later, the truck appeared again and, waved through by the same guards as before, rolled along the drive and disappeared in the direction of Kabul. False alarm. The Mirza reflected at 6 p.m. that in only 15 hours he'd have to be at Kabul airport heading for home. Time was his luxury. It was going to be even colder tonight. If he had to wait until then, the Mirza was prepared to do the job at close quarters. Somehow, in that case, he'd have to get through that barbed wire. Not over it, the height was more than 15 feet. Evade or deal with the dogs and the patrol, and any other guards who might appear. Find where the quarry was and deal with him, and then get out and away if that were possible. If not, Colonel Sakafi would get the news back to Amin. He was only 10 years old, but he was already a good shot and spoke the 2 chief Afghan languages like all the family. It might be, say, 4 years before Amin could undertake the task, but that he would do it and avenge his father, the Mirza was certain. 8:40. It was time for the sunset prayer. 8:50 p.m. There was a car coming, its engine drowning out the wail of the distant Kabul curfew siren. A large Chaika, the Russian model which looked like one of the flashy old Packards, without an escort, coming in very fast off the main road. This must be him. There were lights on in the house now, and a bright one illuminating the front entrance. Why no escort? Because it was probably safer to look anonymous. A car could be ambushed on the road if it had a telltale escort of motorcyclists. The men of the patrol had opened the barbed wire gate before the lumbering 20-foot-long Chaika reached it. They could be seen, dimly, standing to attention just inside. The Mirza suddenly cursed. If he had known more about the conditions, that would have been the perfect place for the ambush. They hadn't surveyed things properly any more than he had. Of course, he'd had no time, but they had had plenty. There was a clump of bushes where he could have hidden, and a couple of grenades would have done the job from there. People on guard, standing to attention, were ridiculous under alert conditions. All very well when you were playing soldiers on a parade ground or standing guard somewhere for ceremonial purposes. Too late for that now. The car swept into the drive, headlamps on full beam, and stopped at the front door. A rectangle of light flooded out. The man who was opening the door looked like a soldier. Mr. Sementsev's wife was wise not to greet her husband herself. Or perhaps she was busy with the dinner arrangements. No chance to shoot. The KGB chief, or at any rate a man of medium height, entered the house, and the car was driven to the back. There must be another garage there, or perhaps the driver was going to the kitchen for a snack and a smoke. More lights in the windows. Yes, that must be the main reception room, ground floor. It had long curtains, filmy ones, which showed up the heavy iron bars. Looking at the windows through the telescopic sight did not help much. The gauze of the curtains fuzzed everything in the room beyond. Except some moving figures. No. What would have been useful was an infrared sight or telescope to sweep the immediate approach to the place to learn of any movement around the house, in case he had to go into close quarters mode. Some infrared sniper scopes intensified even starlight, made the darkness almost as bright as day. The thought suddenly struck him. Infrared, of course. For all he knew, everything he did was being watched from the house by infrared. Then he remembered that the Dragunov had a sophisticated infrared detector. He could check. The Mirza felt for the detector switch. There it was, at the top left of the scope, 3/4 of the way along. Flick it on. He moved the range drum to setting 4 for infrared and looked through the sight. No sign. Now sweep from left to right slowly. If an orange-red blob appeared in the telescope, it would mark the point from which he was being observed. He could hit such a source in the dark by aligning the reticule on it, but the muzzle flash of the shot would give away his presence. No coloured light. No infrared. He relaxed. Time to test the night firing procedure. The Dragunov had a battery-operated shielded lamp which lit the sight needle when a switch on the gun barrel was turned. Yes, it worked perfectly. Just as well the battery hadn't run down. The Mirza could see the glow of his sight perfectly. That about completed the technical work. Time to do some more dynamic exercises, or he wouldn't be able to run when the time came. And, of course, the finger and knuckle exercises to keep supple for the trigger work. 9 o'clock. The Mirza checked in on the mini-transmitter. Too dark to see the washing on the line now. The colonel would turn on the bathroom light to signify "received your message." Yes, there it was. Strange to think that his lifeline was a yard of flimsy wire. He turned back to his quarry's house just in time to see the first cars approaching from the main road. There was a whole string of them. Several were those outdated 5-seater Zhigulis, Russian copies of the old American Plymouth. They cost $12,000 and were greatly coveted by high officials. As automobiles they were rubbish, but as Soviet status symbols they were second only to the top car, the luxurious Zils, imitations of the Lincoln Continental. The cars stopped to be checked and admitted through the security gate. As each car deposited its passengers, it drew to the side and did not immediately leave, allowing the following cars to let their occupants out. Then, when there was a gap, the car turned, went down the drive, passed through the gate, and headed towards the Kabul road again. So, Sementsev was giving a party. As each guest arrived, the Mirza could see a man in the warm glow of the front door with his hand extended. Sometimes a formal handshake, sometimes an embrace with both arms, sometimes a real bear hug. There was no doubt that this thick-set figure was Sementsev, the quarry, the tiger. And he was only about 5 feet 7 inches tall. Good. And the guests? No doubt either that they were the bait which had brought him out. Sitting in his makhan, looking at his tiger, Mirza Timur Kel chuckled to himself. There it was. He had lacked allure, the customary goat. But he had not had to bring his own. The tiger was providing a whole herd of them. The guests did not start to leave Sementsev's house until well after midnight. The Mirza had counted the hours, keeping himself awake with difficulty. In such cramped conditions there was a great danger of falling asleep. He had been there for 15 hours now. No tiger ambush ever lasted more than 9 or 10 hours at the very most. Here they were, at last. Guests leaving, cars picking them up, affectionate and slightly drunken farewells, floodlights on. With luck, he might get the man, though only as a silhouette. That was rather a problem. Every marksman had fired at some time or other in the dark, of course, but always at a lighted target. Whenever Sementsev came to the door to speed a guest, he was not in the light. The bulb shone behind him, outlining his head almost like a halo. Would that affect the aim? Mislead the retina? Cause the bullet to go wide? The Mirza had counted some 30 people going into the house and had not had a single chance to shoot. At least 10 times he had started to squeeze the trigger when, through the magnifying telescope, he had had the host's head in the middle of the crossed threads. But he had always moved away, almost as if he knew that he was in the sights. So there were 30 who would be going home, and not all of them at once, of course, so there should be several opportunities. He knew nothing about Russian parties. How long did people stay? Were they all seen off by their host? In the event, the guests left in ones and twos. Semensev came out each time to say goodbye. They were drifting away now at quite nicely spaced intervals. They must have telephoned for their cars, which were always waiting when the door opened. 7 people had left so far. There were now less than 6 hours left. That raised another question. Would it be better to wait for most of them to go, or to strike as soon as he had a perfect opportunity? In the first case, there would be fewer people available for pursuit. In the second, he could start his escape straight away, while he still felt like it. Because there was an itch in his mind which suggested that he might shoot Semensev and then, instead of retreating, finish off a few more of them just for the sport of it. But no, some might be innocent. He was here as an executioner, not a murderer. He had wedged the gun on an improvised rack, nailed to the branch in front of him, so that he could use it, like the ancient musketeers, to take the weight and prevent the trembling which came from muscle fatigue. The rifle now lay at the perfect angle, its butt against his cheek. It was pointed directly and slightly downwards towards the place where Sementsev's head was usually to be seen when he came out of the door. It was a self-loader, of course. The Mirza sat still, breathing slowly and evenly, with every muscle slack, his eyes glued to the rubber moulding of the sight. Tension caused wobble. At this range, that could be a real problem. He did not want to loose off shot after shot like some cowboy in a movie, however satisfying it might feel. He was a trained sharpshooter. Professionalism almost demanded that he should do the job in one shot. The door opened a crack, then stopped. He noted with satisfaction that his breathing was not affected. The pulse rate, perhaps, he could not tell, but the breath was perfect. He was glad that he did not smoke. Shallow breathing was the best, but it had to be in long, even breaths. Was Sementsev never going to open that door? The time dragged on. 2 o'clock. 5 hours to airport check-in. Now the door crack was opening wider. Sementsev and his friend must have been having a last-minute word, or perhaps it was a drunken handshake. The guests who had come out last were staggering slightly, and one stumbled and even fell, an extra bonus. The door was wide open now. There he was, the tiger, moving forward. If he came any farther, he'd be too woolly, less than a shadow, and it wouldn't be worth trying. Now, here was the man Sementsev was seeing off. Good, there was no confusing them. The other man was very short and slim, and Sementsev looked almost tall beside him. Yes, both were moving slowly, swaying slightly. They were still talking. The guest stepped almost but not quite beyond the range of the light. Better still. Through the magnifying lens of the scope, the hunter saw Sementsev move forward. Now, he was the perfect target. Stay there, murderer, while sentence is carried out. He fired. The recoil compensator was so good he hardly felt the weapon lurch. A tremendous urge to run, to get out of the tree, even to fall out, to run forward and attack or else to run away to safety began to take hold of him. He could feel it spreading through his whole body like the craving for a drug. One word came rushing to the rescue: discipline. The Mirza's army training had not been wasted or forgotten. He sat stock still. This feels like an age, he thought, but I must wait until I see him fall. It must have been less than a second, for so far the man had not moved at all. Then, as if hit by a tremendous punch, Sementsev spun sideways into the lintel of the door, arms upraised, knees stiff, body curving. It was like slow motion, and the Mirza could see his every movement as he fell. He was too experienced a hunter not to know when the quarry has been killed. No, Sementsev had not been merely wounded, however badly. He was clearly and cleanly dead. As the Mirza gathered up his rifle and equipment, he could see that the people at the front door were milling about like ants when their nest is disturbed, their very movements speaking of their puzzlement. He kissed the warm metal of the gun. He had expected to be exhilarated, and he was. But he had not reckoned with the euphoria which now made him want to stop, to go straight home to his wife and child, like someone who has been to an entertainment in town and now wants only to rejoin reality, perhaps to talk it over in a warm room, sipping a cup of tea and munching tiny sweet almond pies with the curtains drawn against the winter. The floodlights had gone out, and there was some firing, though not in his direction. Perhaps a panic-stricken Russian had imagined that they were being attacked by guerrillas from the road. Good. They still did not know what had really happened, so they would not know what to do. Perhaps they needed a good NCO, someone to take charge. "I'm sorry," he said aloud, to the picture of Sementsev's family in his mind. "But it was a debt, and it is not seemly that a man should owe." To Sementsev's shade he said, "You hanged a child, and we gave you a soldier's death." Now he was down from the tree. No cramp. Lucky he had remembered to do static exercises. Well, perhaps a bit stiff. That would soon wear off. No time to talk to the colonel, but the old man must know that something, good or bad, had happened, since there had been no call at 2:00. Over the wall, onto the ground, now down the road, up the slope, hard to see in the dark. He followed the road, though quite slowly, by dragging and tapping a stick which he had picked up. Moving incongruously like a blind man at a trot, the tap of the wood telling him when he was off the tarmac surface. The smell of honeysuckle was now very strong. There was a bush of it directly beside his destination. There it was now, the honeysuckle. To the side, yes, the shape of the huge drainage pipe, well over 2 meters in diameter, just up from the road, concreted into the rocks on the slope, full of brushwood, nice and dry. Into the pipe. Hunter turned hunted. He arranged the brushwood at the mouth of the segment of pipe. Not too densely now, that might encourage someone to investigate. There were a lot of these pipes, set starkly into the hillside. Could they, would they, search them all? Sometimes, of course, they were full of scorpions. The Afghan black scorpion was the most deadly on earth. He shuddered. Still, this was the best idea that they had had when they had made their plan. If a pursuit party came along this road and looked into the pipe, they'd have him for sure. With his teeth, the Mirza tore open a plastic bag and started to smear its fatty contents all over his clothes. There was no time to take them off. Then he applied the stuff liberally to his hands, face, and head. Snow leopard grease. For centuries, the Pashtun tribesmen had used this when on a raid to approach a house or pass through towns. Dogs were mortally afraid of the leopard smell and would not go anywhere near it. In fact, when they got wind of it, they fell silent, probably prompted by some ancestral fear. He must be less than 700 yards from Sementsev's house now, on the main road, like every kind of a fool. But he had refused to make his way to where the colonel was waiting. If there was a house-to-house search, and that was possible even in this place of scattered dwellings, old Sakafi could be well compromised. It was the colonel who had thought of the leopard grease when he had reluctantly agreed to the Mirza's hiding in the pipe. Now he could hear the dogs, and smiled. They were on the right trail, but he guessed that it was most likely to be because whoever was in charge found it easier to hare down a surfaced road than to scramble across country, through parks and gardens, streams and lakes, in a prosperous suburb which was half a rocky wilderness than for any other reason. He must be an old soldier, probably a senior sergeant. That was how they always thought. Still, he would also be doing some real hunting, even if only because there would be other men with him who would observe his zeal or otherwise. The dogs were getting closer, barking furiously as they ran, and the men's voices were mingled with them now. It was strange how one thought under stress. The barking now actually sounded to him like the words, "Come out, come out." He remembered that someone was supposed to have said to a squirrel, "Why don't you come out in the winter time?" The squirrel had answered, "Look how they treat me in the summer. Why should the winter be any better?" Now they were very near, say about 100 yards away. No, even nearer. There were the beams of their flashlights, actually probing through the loose brushwood of his shelter, getting in his eyes. Now there were tackety boots turning, slowing down. They were coming close to the drainpipe. He could hear voices, could make out their speech. Russian. He couldn't understand a word. He kept absolutely still. The dogs had started to whine, then fallen silent. Now the guards were cursing them, urging them on. Maybe one of the men would come and check the pipe himself. Just room enough to aim this rifle from the hip, like a cowboy with a shotgun. Yes, that was it. He would take some of them with him. 9 rounds left, probably more than enough to go round. In the dark, though, he'd have to shoot at point-blank range. Remember to aim just above and to the right of the flashlight's bulb, for the heart. Of course, if the Russian had the light in his left hand... No, they were going away. The sound of boots receding down the road, the dogs barking again. Everything normal. Thank you, heroic and kindly snow leopard. I'll call my next son by your honoured name. The time now? Just before 3 o'clock. 4 hours to airport check-in. Could that lifetime have lasted for less than an hour? Colonel Sakafi would now be listening all the time. He could call in now. The Mirza arranged the transmitting wire so that it was outside the pipe, with no obstacle between it and the Jasmine house, and connected the battery. "Is that you, my bulbul, my nightingale? This is your Manjung pining for his Laila. Opportunity is dear, job done successfully, and time is a sword. I am well and hold up as arranged." He added, "As arranged, beautiful lady, 6 kisses at your boudoir window." The code for pick me up here at 6 in the morning. There was nothing more that he could do. No way to get confirmation that the message got through. The only thing now was to wait. It would be suicide for them to try to collect him during curfew, which didn't end until 4:30 a.m., even without the hue and cry for the killer of the KGB man. 3 hours to go. Funny how tired he felt. The adrenaline must all be used up. He packed up his things as neatly as he could by touch, and lay back instantly asleep. The revving of a Land Rover engine woke him. It was backing off the road, its rear end coming towards the entrance to the pipe. As it touched the circular concrete rim, the Mirza tore the screen of brushwood away and saw Colonel Sakafi grinning from under the soft top canopy. "Well done, warrior hero. 6 in the morning, no Nikolais in sight." He was wide awake now. The bundle had been thrown into the back. The colonel was making room for him. Halim finished the imaginary task under the bonnet which had covered the embarkation, and they were off. On the way to the airport, the grease-ridden Pashtun became the Indian tourist again, taking his suit from the case which the colonel handed him. There was a roadblock on the highway, but the tour agency car was raved right through by a bored trio of guards, one policeman, an Afghan corporal, and a Russian private. None of them could read the Roman letters of the English text, or the Sanskrit of the Hindi on the Mirza's Indian passport anyway. At the airport, the Mirza described the events of the night. Nobody seemed to notice at the entrance gate that the guard dogs tried to strain away from the residual whiff of snow leopard still on the Mirza. Halim flashed his official card and managed to get hold of a soldier to guard the Land Rover. The night before he had caught someone unscrewing the petrol cap, while in his other hand he had a packet of sugar already opened. It was a complicated life, working for both sides. The Mirza shook hands with his friends as the announcement called passengers to check in for flight IC-452. "What are you going to do with the gun, Colonel Seb?" "Keep it, of course." "Supposing they search the wagon on your way back to Kabul?" "They usually don't search semi-official transport, except in curfew hours. But in any case, I like to take a little risk now and then. It seems to keep one young." They embraced. "Thank you for your hospitality." "You have honoured us." "It was my duty." "Safe journey." "I entrust you to God." They might have been any ordinary people seeing off a friend after a short and refreshing holiday, a midweek break. There was unlikely to be any complication now. The Mirza checked in and picked up his hand baggage, through passport control, now the departure lounge. "Boarding, please." Air India stewardesses in saris, smiling passengers, on the plane. By 2:00 that afternoon, Mirza Ilyas Khan was going up the steps of the office building near Connaught Circus. The chaparazzi on duty at the door came to attention and saluted with that imitation of the British gesture which is still standard in independent India. Unlike the westernized office staff who preferred to use English, he spoke in Urdu. "Aapka mizaj?" "Tik merbani." "Well, thank you." "Koi khabar? Any news?" "Hech, none." As he walked past the open door to the room where the head of his department sat ever watchfully, he heard the familiar voice and braced himself for the stilted officialese. "I am glad to see that you are back in station, Mr. Khan. It is gratifying to me that you are not late also." The Mirza entered the room and bowed. The heat was stifling after Kabul, and the air conditioner was still on the blink. "It is to be hoped that your family members are well now?" The director smiled mechanically. "Yes, sir. Everything went well and within the time which you so kindly allotted." When they had seen the Air India plane take off at Kabul, Colonel Sakafi and young Halim headed homewards. The Land Rover stopped on the way beside the grave of their kinsman, the Mujahid Aslam Jan, and they got out. The colonel slipped something from his pocket and pressed it into the still soft earth in the midst of the flowers at the gravehead. It was a single, empty, 7.62mm brass cartridge case. "It is done, Shaheed, martyr, Aslam Jan," he said. While the Mirza returned to his office nearly 1,000 miles away, a messenger was shown into the cave where Adam sat, secure within the Pagman Mountains. "A verbal dispatch by relay runner from Colonel Sakafi in Kabul, Commandant Kara Kush." The man stepped forward, kissed Adam's hand, and stood with hand on heart. "Very well. Give the message." The message runs, "The execution of the murderer Sementsev in retribution for the death of the Mujahid Aslam Jan took place this morning before dawn outside Kabul, in accordance with the traditional law. Sentence was carried out by the warrior Mirza Ilyas Khan of the Timur clan."